Cole Brennan sat on the porch of his transformed ranch, watching the Arizona sun sink below fields that had once been nothing but sage and regret. Beside him, his grandson Samuel shifted in his chair, 25 years old and full of questions the way young men always are. "Grandpa Cole," Samuel said, "I heard you lived alone out here for more than 6 years. How did you bear it?" The old man's hands, gnarled as mesquite roots, tightened on the arms of his chair. At 94, Cole's eyes still held that storm-colored clarity that had seen too much and remembered everything. "I didn't bear it, son. I was just waiting to die, until the day that door opened and changed everything." "What door?" Cole looked toward the cabin, rebuilt and expanded over the decades, but still carrying the bones of what it had been. "The door where an Apache woman and a child stood on my threshold in the summer of 1884. I was 58 years old and wanted nothing more than to join my wife and boy in the ground. But sometimes strangers arrive to teach us how to live." He closed his eyes, and the years fell away like autumn leaves. June 1884, Arizona Territory. The knock came just after dawn. 3 sharp raps that shattered the silence Cole Brennan had wrapped around himself like a burial shroud. He froze in the center of his cabin, coffee cup halfway to his lips, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs in a way it hadn't since Shiloh, since Gettysburg, since all those battlefields where death had called his name and somehow missed. Nobody came out here. Nobody knew this place existed anymore. The second round of knocking was harder, more insistent, and Cole set the cup down with a hand that trembled just enough to spill dark liquid across the worn wooden table. The calendar on the wall still read August 1878. 6 years since he'd bothered to change it. 6 years since time had stopped meaning anything. He moved toward the door, each step a negotiation between his body's protest and his mind's unwanted curiosity. His hand went to the Colt peacemaker on his hip, old cavalry instincts never quite dead, then forced itself away. Ridiculous. He was an old man jumping at shadows in a tomb he'd built for himself. When Cole opened the door, the morning light hit him like a physical blow, too bright, too sudden, and for a moment all he saw was a silhouette, impossibly tall, against the pale sky. Then his eyes adjusted, and the world tilted sideways. Standing on his porch was an Apache woman, and beside her, partially hidden in her shadow, an Apache boy of perhaps 10 years. Cole's first instinct was pure frontier reflex, 6 years of hearing about raids and resistance, about Geronimo's warriors and the savage threat. His hand actually moved toward his gun before his brain caught up. She was alone. She carried a leather suitcase. And she was looking at him not with hostility, but with something closer to exhausted assessment, like a general surveying unfavorable terrain. She was dressed in traditional buckskin, intricate beadwork across the chest in turquoise and white that must have taken hundreds of hours to create. Her hair hung in a single braid, black as a raven's wing, tied with a beaded leather cord. She stood perhaps 5'9", broad-shouldered and strong, in a way that made his own weathered frame feel suddenly frail. But it was her eyes that stopped him, dark as obsidian, sharp as a hawk's, holding depths of experience that made his own pain look like shallow water. The boy stood slightly behind her, one hand clutching a small cloth bag, the other staying close to her side. His eyes were wide and wary, old beyond his years, in that way Cole had seen in drummer boys during the war, children forced to grow up too fast by circumstances beyond their control. "Cole Brennan." Her voice was low, controlled, with an edge that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else on God's green earth. It wasn't a question. She knew who he was. Cole managed a nod, his throat too dry for words. His mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. How did she know his name? What did she want? Was this some kind of elaborate trap? She held out a folded paper yellowed at the edges, creased from being carried too long in what must have been brutal conditions. "Then I believe this concerns you." Cole's fingers were clumsy as he took it, unfolded it, saw handwriting he recognized, but words that made absolutely no sense. An arrangement. A contract. His name signed at the bottom in ink he'd never touched. Thomas Carver's name as witness. The paper trembled in his grip as his mind tried to make sense of what he was reading. Mail order bride. Terms of agreement. Payment received, $75. "I never wrote this." The words came out rougher than he intended, anger rising like bile. I never sent for anybody. Not a woman, not a... His eyes dropped to the boy. Not a child. And yet here we are. She said it without emotion, stating a fact as immutable as the mountains behind her. No plea in her voice, no desperation, just cold, hard reality. Cole looked past her, scanning the empty land stretching in every direction. No wagon, no horse, nothing but miles of nothing, and this woman who'd somehow crossed it with a child in tow. How did you even get here? We walked. She shifted her weight slightly, and for the first time he saw the exhaustion she was hiding. The way her shoulders stayed rigid through sheer will, the blisters on her feet visible through worn moccasins. 5 days from Fort Defiance. We were told you were expecting us, that you wanted help. A family. The word hit him like a fist. Family. He'd had a family once. A wife named Abigail with soft hands and softer voice. A son named Nathaniel who'd lived just long enough to learn his father's face. Both buried under 6 feet of Arizona hardpan while he was 200 miles away buying cattle that no longer mattered. Well, you were told wrong. Cole thrust the paper back at her, but she didn't take it. Just stood there, immovable as the doorframe. I don't know what kind of mistake this is, but I didn't arrange this. Didn't want this. Any of it. Something flickered in her expression. Too quick to read. Neither did I. The silence that followed was heavy with all the things neither of them would say. Cole's mind was already calculating distances, impossibilities. 5 days on foot through territory that could break a man with a horse and supplies. She shouldn't have survived it. The boy certainly shouldn't have. Yet here they stood, looking at him with eyes that held no plea, no desperation, just a kind of cold evaluation that made him feel like he was the one being measured and found wanting. You need to leave, he said as firmly as he could manage. Go back where you came from. With what? The question was sharp, surgical, cutting through his dismissal like a knife through silk. Every coin we had went into that payment. The agent said housing, food, protection, a new life away from... She stopped herself, jaw tight. There is no going back, for either of us. Cole felt the trap closing around both of them, felt the weight of a decision he'd never asked to make settling on shoulders that had already carried too much for too long. Then she said something that changed everything. Her eyes fixed on something behind him, inside the cabin, and her voice took on a matter-of-fact quality that somehow made the words more ominous. Besides, that storm coming over the ridge will be here by nightfall. Neither of us will be going anywhere for a while. Cole turned to look where she was staring, saw the dark line of clouds building on the horizon like an approaching army, black and pregnant with violence. He'd seen enough Arizona storms to know she was right. Once it hit, travel would be impossible, maybe deadly. When he turned back, she'd already picked up her suitcase and taken one step across his threshold. The boy followed like a shadow, silent and watchful. The question wasn't whether she was staying. It was whether Cole had any choice left at all. Ayanna stepped inside without waiting for permission, and Cole found himself moving backward into his own home like a guest retreating from the host. She set the suitcase down near the door with deliberate care, her eyes already cataloging the space with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to assess shelter for survival rather than comfort. The boy, Elijah, stood close to her side, his eyes taking in everything with the same sharp awareness. Cole saw intelligence there and wariness, and something else he couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe, as if the child understood exactly what kind of man stood before him. The cabin was small, brutally spare, one room serving as kitchen, bedroom, and living space all at once. A narrow bed against the far wall, blankets gathering dust because Cole hadn't slept in it since the night he came home to find his family gone. A stone fireplace that hadn't seen a proper fire in months, shelves holding more dust than supplies, a table covered in old papers and dirty dishes from God knew when. This is it. She didn't say it with judgment, just stating an observation that made Cole's face heat with something between shame and anger. I don't entertain. He moved past her, putting the table between them like a barricade. And I told you, this is a mistake. Thomas Carver had no right to do whatever he did. Who is Thomas Carver? My neighbor. Cole gestured vaguely northwest. Lives 2 days' ride from here. Used to check on me once a season before I told him to stop. He picked up the document again, staring at the signature that looked so much like his own. This is forgery. Has to be. Ayanna crossed to the window, her movements quiet despite her size. She studied the approaching storm with the focus of someone reading language in the weather, interpreting signs that Cole had learned in his years on the frontier, but that she seemed to understand on some deeper, more instinctive level. When did you last see this, Thomas? 6 months, maybe 8. Cole tried to remember. Time had a way of blurring when every day looked the same, when the only markers were the changing seasons and the slow accumulation of neglect. He brought supplies I didn't ask for, talked about how I needed help with the ranch, how I was wasting away. I told him to leave me alone. And so he sent me. Her voice was flat, but something underneath suggested she understood the cruel logic of it, the way well-meaning people could destroy lives while thinking they were saving them. Men like that believe they know better than the choices you make. The observation was too accurate, too knowing, and Cole found himself looking at her differently. Not as an intrusion, but as another person caught in someone else's plan, another victim of good intentions gone catastrophically wrong. You said you paid to come here. Paid who? Ayanna turned from the window, and for the first time he saw something other than stoic control in her face, something that looked almost like anger, cold and carefully contained. A man in Fort Defiance, Marcus Webb. He had papers, certificates, said there were ranchers looking for arrangements. She chose her words carefully, like someone navigating a field of broken glass. Good men who needed help, who would provide protection and a new life. For women with children, women with no other options. Cole felt anger rise, not at her, but at the whole rotten system that had put them both here, that preyed on the desperate and the lonely with equal ruthlessness. That's what they told you. His voice was rough. And you believed it? Her eyes hardened to obsidian chips. I believed it was better than the alternative. The words hung between them, heavy with implications Cole wasn't ready to explore. He looked away first, moved to the fireplace, started building a fire he didn't know how to share, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind raced. The storm will last through tomorrow at least, maybe longer. You and the boy can stay until it passes. Then you'll need to find somewhere else. Where? The question was direct, surgical, cutting to the heart of the impossibility he was proposing. Back to Fort Defiance, where the man who lied to me can do it to someone else. To San Carlos Reservation, where there is no land, no food, and men who... She stopped herself, jaw tight, and Cole saw the first real crack in her armor. Saw the fear underneath, carefully controlled but undeniably there. I had a daughter. The words came flat, protective distance in every syllable, and Cole felt something in his chest constrict. Her name was Istis. It means snow in my language. She was 7 years old when she died on San Carlos Reservation 2 years ago. Ayanna met his eyes, and in hers he saw a grief that matched his own, waxed and terrible and never quite buried. There was no medicine, no food, just waiting for death. Watching children waste away while government agents grew fat on rations meant for us. Cole's hands stilled on the flint and steel. He thought about Nathaniel, about holding his son's tiny body in the photograph that now lay face down in a drawer, because looking at it hurt more than forgetting. But at least his son had died quickly, mercifully, from fever and not from deliberate cruelty dressed up as policy. My husband Dakota died the year before that. Ayanna continued, her voice never wavering, each word precise and controlled. Bounty hunters shot him. They thought he was one of Geronimo's warriors. He was just trying to hunt deer to feed us on land that was ours for hundreds of years. Land the white man said we were trespassing on. She looked down at the PA who stood silent and still beside the suitcase. Elijah is not my son by blood, but I am all he has. His parents, both warriors, are dead. First his father in a cavalry raid, then his mother from consumption on the reservation. I took him when she died. We escaped together 14 months ago. Survived by hiding, by taking work where we could find it, by staying invisible. The fire sparked and died. sparked and awed. Finally caught, Cole straightened slowly, his back protesting the movement, and turned to face her fully. "My wife and son died 6 years ago," he heard himself say, the words coming from some deep place he'd thought sealed off forever. "Scarlet fever took them both in the same week. I was 200 miles away buying cattle. Rode for 3 days straight when I got word. Nearly killed my horse doing it. Came back to find them already buried. Thomas and the neighbors did it. Kinda them." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "I never got to say goodbye. Never got to do anything but stand at a grave and wonder why I was still breathing when they weren't." Ayanna observed him in long silence, and Cole felt uncomfortably seen, like she was reading something in him he'd tried to bury along with his family. "So we are both here because of loss," she said finally. "Both here because someone else decided they knew what we needed." She moved to her suitcase, opened it with careful hands. Inside were folded clothes, a few personal items, and something wrapped in cloth that she kept one hand over protectively. "Perhaps instead of fighting about who is more trapped, we should discuss how to survive until we are not." Cole wanted to argue to defend the fortress of solitude he'd built around his grief, to explain that survival was the last thing he wanted. But as another leak started in the roof and he had nowhere left to put a container, as he looked around at the cabin that had become less shelter and more tomb, he found he had no answer at all. "You and the boy take the bed," he heard himself say. "I'll sleep by the fire." Ayanna's expression didn't change, but something in her posture relaxed fractionally, the first hint that beneath the armor was a person who'd been braced for rejection, for violence, for all the cruelties she'd learned to expect from the world. "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Cole moved toward the door, needing air, even if it meant facing the approaching storm. "I'm not being kind. I'm just too tired to fight about everything in one day." He stepped out onto the porch just as the first drops of rain hit his face like small warnings. Behind him, through the open door, he heard Ayanna moving around his cabin with careful respect, heard the soft murmur of her voice as she spoke to Elijah in Apache, words he couldn't understand but whose tone he recognized. Comfort, safety, home. The storm broke overhead with a crack of thunder that shook the walls and sent the horses screaming in the distance. Rain came in sheets, turning the world beyond the porch into nothing but gray violence and the roar of water finding every weakness in his defenses. Cole stood there getting soaked, watching his land disappear behind the deluge, and realized with cold certainty that the next few days would test more than just his hospitality. They would test everything he'd built his isolation on, every wall he'd erected between himself and the world, every reason he'd found to keep breathing without actually living. And he wasn't sure any of those foundations would hold. Inside, Ayanna carefully unwrapped the cloth bundle from her suitcase. The corn-husk doll lay in her hands like a prayer, tiny beaded moccasins still perfect despite everything. Istis's doll, the last physical piece of her daughter she had left. She placed it on the floor beside the bed with the reverence of creating an altar, and Elijah sat down next to it without being told, his small hand reaching out to touch it with the gentleness of someone who understood what sacred things look like. Through the open door, Ayanna could see Cole Brennan standing in the rain, getting soaked, staring out at nothing. She recognized the posture. It was the stance of a man who'd forgotten how to come in from the storm, who'd become so used to the cold and wet that shelter felt foreign, dangerous, like a promise that would inevitably be broken. She knew that feeling intimately. The storm raged through the night. Rain hammered the roof, finding every weakness Cole had ignored for years. Drips started in 4 places, then 6, then so many he stopped counting. Ayanna calmly repositioned their belongings to avoid the water, her face showing nothing. But Cole saw the way her eyes tracked each new leak, cataloging the damage with the precision of someone who understood that small failures led to larger catastrophes. "The roof needs repair," she observed around midnight, her voice cutting through the storm's roar. Needed it for a while. Cole sat by the fire, gun within reach from old habit, watching the flames and trying not to watch her. "You have been alone that long." She was working with leather strips now, braiding them with quick, practiced movements that spoke of years of repetition. "That you stopped maintaining your own shelter?" The question cut deeper than he wanted to admit. "I maintain what matters." And the roof does not matter? She tied off one braid, started another. What about the corral fence I saw, with half the rails rotted through? Or the well cover with a gap large enough for anything to fall in and contaminate your water? Cole's jaw tightened. You've been here less than a day, and you're cataloging my failures. I am cataloging what needs fixing. Her hands never stopped moving. If we are staying even a few days, I would prefer not to drink fouled water or sleep under a roof that might collapse. Nobody asked you to stay at all. No, she agreed, her voice maddeningly calm. But here we are. Another drip started, this one directly above the table where Thomas's forged document still lay. Ayanna grabbed it quickly, but the ink was already running. Thomas Carver's signature bleeding into illegibility. She looked at the ruined paper, then at Cole, and something passed between them that wasn't quite understanding, but was maybe the first hint of it. Two people recognizing in each other the same desperate survival, the same determination to keep moving forward even when forward had lost all meaning. Tomorrow, she said quietly, setting the document aside, when the rain slows, I will patch the roof. You will show me where you keep the pitch and tar. I can patch my own roof. Can you? She held up the ruined document, water still dripping from its edges. Or have you been letting everything wash away for so long, you have forgotten how to hold things together? The question landed like a physical blow. Cole wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he'd earned the right to let things fall apart after what he'd lost. But as he looked around at the cabin, at the accumulating water, at the evidence of 6 years of systematic neglect, he found he had no defense that didn't sound hollow even to his own ears. Outside, the storm raged on, trapping them together in a space growing smaller by the hour. Elijah had fallen asleep on the bed, curled around Istis's doll like it was the most precious thing in the world. Ayanna sat on the floor near the fire, her back against the wall, eyes half closed but alert in the way of someone who'd learned that true sleep was a luxury reserved for safety she no longer believed in. Cole tried not to look at them, tried not to notice the way firelight played across Ayanna's face, softening the hard lines and revealing something younger underneath, something that hadn't been completely destroyed by loss and displacement and the brutal arithmetic of survival. He pulled out his harmonica instead, the Honor Marine Band he hadn't touched in 6 years, and turned it over in his hands. The last time he'd played it was the night before Abigail and Nathaniel died, playing a lullaby for his son while his wife smiled from the doorway. The memory should have been painful, should have sent him reaching for the bottle he'd finally emptied 2 years ago. Instead, he felt something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the faint stirring of something that might, in a different life, have been hope. You play? Iana's voice cut through his reverie. Used to, during the war mostly, help pass the time between trying not to die. Will you play now? Cole looked at her, surprised. Why? Because Elijah has never heard music, she said simply. Not real music. The reservation had no instruments, and in hiding we could make no sound that might draw attention. Her eyes met his across the fire. And because I think you need to remember what your hands can create instead of what they have destroyed. The words hit harder than they should have, cutting through defenses Cole didn't even know he'd raised. He brought the harmonica to his lips, hesitated, then began to play. The melody came unbidden, something old and solemn and beautiful that he'd learned from a fellow soldier at Shiloh right before that man took a mini ball through the throat and died choking on his own blood. But played here, in this cabin, with the storm raging outside and 2 strangers huddled in the warmth, the song transformed. It wasn't a dirge anymore. It was something else. A bridge between what was lost and what might still be possible. When Cole finished, silence filled the cabin like water finding its level. Then Elijah's voice, small and sleepy from the bed. That was beautiful. Cole turned to find the boy sitting up, eyes wide in the firelight, looking at him with something that might have been wonder. My father used to sing, Elijah continued in halting English, the words careful and considered, before the soldiers came. I do not remember the songs, but I remember the feeling. He touched his chest. Here. Cole's throat tightened. He looked at Ayanna and saw tears tracking silently down her face. The first emotion he'd seen break through her careful control. Thank you, she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear it over the storm, for giving him that memory back. They didn't speak again that night. Ayana lay down beside Elijah on the bed, fully clothed, one hand on the doll and the other on the boy. Cole sat by the fire, gun across his lap from habit, and watched the flames burn down to embers while the storm hammered the world outside. He thought about Thomas Carver, about well-meaning interference and the violence of assuming you knew what was best for someone else's life. He thought about Marcus Webb and his territorial matching service, preying on desperate women with children, sending them into the wilderness based on forged documents and false promises. But mostly he thought about the woman and child sleeping in his dead wife's bed, about the impossible journey they'd survived to get here, about what kind of desperation drove a person to walk 5 days through hostile territory with no guarantee of anything but more suffering at the end. And he thought about himself, about the man he'd become in 6 years of isolation, letting his ranch rot around him while he waited for death to remember his address, about whether that man was worth saving, whether he even wanted to be saved. The answer should have been no. Should have been the same answer he'd given himself every morning for 6 years when he woke up disappointed to still be breathing. But somewhere in the night, as the storm began to ease and the first hints of gray dawn crept through the gaps in his walls, Cole Brennan felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope exactly, not anything so presumptuous, just the faintest possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a reason he'd opened that door this morning. That maybe some arrivals change everything. That maybe the worst loneliness isn't being alone at all, but being with someone and still feeling invisible. And if that was true, if he could see these strangers and be seen by them in return, then perhaps isolation wasn't protection, but just another kind of death. He'd been dying slowly for 6 years. When dawn finally broke pale and clean, the storm exhausted, Cole stood and stretched his aching joints. 58 years old and feeling every one of them. He moved to the window and looked out at his land, seeing it with new eyes. The corral fence sagging, the south pasture choked with weeds, the well cover broken, all the accumulated damage of not caring whether he lived or died. Behind him, Ayana stirred, instantly alert in that way he recognized from his own war-trained reflexes. The storm has passed, she observed, standing with fluid grace that made his own stiff movements feel ancient. For now, Cole turned to face her. Another will come, always does out here. Then we should repair the roof before it does. She said it like it was already decided, like she'd moved past asking permission and into the territory of simple partnership. Cole opened his mouth to argue, to remind her that she was leaving as soon as travel was possible, that this wasn't her home and never would be. But the words died on his tongue, because looking at her standing there in the gray dawn light, at Elijah stirring awake behind her, at the corn-husk doll still clutched in the boy's hands, Cole realized something that terrified him more than any bullet ever had. He didn't want them to leave. Not yet, maybe not ever. And that single thought, that crack in the armor he'd built around his heart, changed everything that came after. "I'll get the pitch and tar," he heard himself say. "You'll need to show me what you see that I've been missing." Ayana's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened fractionally, and Cole understood that she'd been testing him, waiting to see if he was the kind of man who could admit when he was wrong, when he needed help, when pride was just another word for slow suicide. "I will show you," she said, "and you will show me how this land works, what it needs, what it can become if we stop punishing it for our grief." The "we" hung in the air between them, fraught with implications neither was ready to name. But it was there, undeniable as the sunrise breaking over the ridge, as the smell of rain-washed earth, as the sound of Elijah's quiet breathing in the stillness. Cole nodded once, sharp and decisive. The first real decision he'd made in 6 years that wasn't about managing his own slow decay. "We'll start with the roof," he said. "Everything else can wait." But both of them knew he was lying. Nothing could wait anymore. Not the fence, not the well, not the questions hanging between them like spider silk, invisible but strong enough to catch and hold. Not the future that had just become possible again, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Cole Brennan's grandson leaned forward in his chair, the sunset forgotten as the old story wrapped around him like a spell. "So she stayed," Samuel said. "They both stayed." They stayed, Cole confirmed, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been a smile. And in staying, they saved my life, though it took me longer than it should have to understand that. What happened next? The old man's eyes grew distant, seeing not the prosperous ranch of 1920, but the broken-down homestead of 1884, seeing not his comfortable present, but the dangerous past that had forged it. We worked, Cole said simply, and in working, we learned about each other, about ourselves, about what it means to build something from nothing when you thought nothing was all you had left. June 1884, Brennan Ranch. Dawn broke clean and merciless over Arizona territory, the storm's fury replaced by a silence so complete it hurt Cole's ears. He woke stiff and aching on the floor by the dead fire, every joint protesting 6 hours on hard-packed earth. 58 years old and feeling like 80. The smell hit him first. Coffee, but not his usual bitter brew. Something richer, mixed with prestige, and something else he couldn't identify. And food. Actual food being cooked on his stove by hands that knew what they were doing. Ayanna stood at his cast iron skillet, working it like she'd been cooking in this kitchen for years instead of hours. She'd found bacon in his smokehouse, bacon he'd forgotten existed, and was making some kind of flatbread that sent his stomach growling despite himself. Elijah sat at the table, eyes tracking every movement Cole made with the wariness of an animal that had learned the hard way to never fully trust, to always keep one eye on the exit. "Where did you find the bacon?" Cole's voice came out rougher than intended, thick with sleep and something else he didn't want to examine. "The smokehouse." Ayanna didn't look at him, focused on the task at hand. "You had half a side hanging. Probably forgot about it." He had. Stopped checking months ago, stopped caring about food beyond what kept him functional. The admission sat heavy in his chest. She plated the food with efficient movements, set it on the table. The flatbread was golden and slightly puffed, the bacon crispy. It looked like something from his memories of Abigail's cooking, from a life before loss had taught him that caring about meals was just another vulnerability. "Eat," Ayanna commanded. "Then we work." Cole wanted to argue on principle, to assert that this was his ranch and he made the decisions. But he was hungry, and the food smelled better than anything he'd made in 6 years, and somewhere in the night he'd crossed a threshold he couldn't quite name. He sat. He ate. The flatbread was dense and slightly sweet. The bacon perfectly done. He hadn't known his taste buds still worked, hadn't realized how much he'd reduced food to fuel and nothing more. Ayanna ate across from him, methodical and efficient. She drank her coffee black like him. No wasted motion, no small talk. Just sustenance taken in silence, while the morning light crept across the cabin floor and Elijah watched them both with eyes that missed nothing. When they finished, she stood and moved to the door, looking up at the roof with the assessing gaze of someone who understood that small problems became catastrophic failures if ignored long enough. "The roof first," she said, "before the next rain. Then the well cover because water is life. The corral can wait, but not long if you want to use those horses running wild out there." She'd already planned the day, taken command with such natural authority that Cole found himself nodding before his pride could object. Part of him wanted to resist, to reclaim control of his own deterioration. But another part, a part he'd thought dead, felt something close to relief. Someone else making decisions. Someone else giving a damn. "I'll get the tar bucket from the shed," he heard himself say. Watching Ayanna climb onto his roof was like watching something wooled and perfectly adapted to its environment. She moved across the wet shingles in her moccasins with the sure-footedness of a mountain cat, no hesitation, no fear. Her buckskin dress allowed movement where a white woman's skirts would have tangled and killed her. Cole stood below, passing up supplies, and found himself saying, "You're going to break your neck up there." She didn't look down, just kept working. "Then you will have one less problem." There was no self-pity in it, no plea for reassurance. Just dark humor delivered with such deadpan conviction that it startled a laugh out of Cole, the first genuine sound of amusement that had escaped his throat in 6 years. It sounded rusty, foreign, like a voice belonging to someone else. Ayanna paused in her work, glanced down at him with something that might have been surprise, then returned to the task with what he could have sworn was the ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She worked for 2 hours while the sun climbed higher and turned the desert into a furnace. Cole watched her find every weakness he'd ignored, every place where water had won its patient war against wood and tar. She used rags to stuff gaps, sealed them with pitch, her movements practiced and sure. The work was crude but effective, function prioritized over beauty in a way that spoke to something deep in Cole's war-trained pragmatism. He noticed her hands, scarred and calloused, strong and capable. A healer's hands and a warrior's hands occupying the same body, the same history. Notice the way she paused occasionally to orient herself, checking sun position and wind direction like she was constantly mapping escape routes, constantly prepared for the world to turn hostile without warning. "You've done this before," he called up. "Not on ranches." She spread tar with strokes that suggested muscle memory built over years. "But wiki-ups need repair too. Apache homes, knowledge translates if you are willing to learn." She paused again, this time looking toward the eastern ridge, and murmured something in Apache. Low and rhythmic, the words flowing like water over stone. "What was that?" She glanced down, and for the first time he saw something soften in her expression. Not vulnerability exactly, but a willingness to let him see past the armor. "Prayer, asking the mountain spirits to hold this roof strong, to protect those who shelter beneath it." Cole shifted uncomfortably. It sounded like superstition, like Indian magic, like all the things he'd been taught to dismiss as primitive nonsense. Then he caught himself. That was exactly the kind of thinking that got Apaches killed, that justified taking their land and destroying their way of life. She was just praying, like anyone would, like he used to before God stopped listening or he stopped believing. He wasn't sure which. "Your people pray too," Ayana added, reading his discomfort with unnerving accuracy. "Just with different words. Same sky hears both. Same spirits watch over all who ask with honest hearts." The simple wisdom of it hit harder than it should have. Cole looked away, uncomfortable with how easily she'd seen through him, how quickly she'd identified and dismissed his prejudice without anger or judgment, just patient correction. When Ayana finally climbed down, her clothes were soaked with sweat and streaked with tar. She didn't complain, didn't even seem to notice the heat that had Cole's shirt sticking to his back. She just accepted the coffee he'd made, hot enough to burn despite the temperature, and drank it like it was water in the desert. They stood on the porch together, not quite side by side, but no longer maintaining the careful distance of strangers who didn't trust each other. The world had revealed itself in the storm's aftermath, colors bright and sharp, the air so clean it almost hurt to breathe. "You didn't have to do that," Cole said, his voice rougher than he intended, thick with something he refused to name. "Yes, I did." Ayana blew on her coffee, steam rising between them. "I do not accept shelter I do not earn. Even shelter you did not ask for." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Especially then. Dependency is its own kind of death." The words cut deeper than any blade. Cole had told himself his isolation was independence, that refusing help was strength, that needing no one made him invulnerable. But standing here with someone who actually understood the difference between independence and self-destruction, he felt the lie of it settling heavy in his chest. "The corral fence," he heard himself say. "If you're right about the rot, I'll need help replacing the rails." It wasn't an invitation to stay. Wasn't even a thank you, but Ayana's expression shifted fractionally, something that might have been respect crossing her features. "Show me where you keep the lumber." They worked through the afternoon while the sun turned the sky white with heat. Cole's body protested every movement, 6 years of neglect catching up with compound interest. Ayana seemed tireless, but he noticed she was pacing herself, rationing energy with the discipline of someone who'd learned that survival was a marathon, not a sprint. The work was quiet, methodical. Ayana assessed each rail with hands that knew wood, testing for rot with her thumb, watching the way it had crumbled or held firm. She marked what needed replacing, measured for new cuts, all without tools, doing it by eye and experience in a way that made Cole realize how much knowledge he'd lost by working alone for so long. "Where did you learn this?" he asked as they fitted a new rail into place. "My husband." The words came flat and final, a door closing on a room Cole wasn't invited to enter. She drove a nail with 3 precise strikes, the rhythm almost meditative. Cole waited, learning that pushing her would get him nowhere, that information would come in its own time or not at all. "About Dakota," she continued after a long silence. "Before the reservation, before everything changed, he could build anything from nothing, make a home from earth and wood and skill. He taught me because he said a woman should be able to survive without a man if the spirits demanded it." She reached for another nail, and Cole saw her hand tremble just slightly before she controlled it. "I did not know I would need that knowledge so soon, that the spirits would take him and leave me with only his teachings and our daughter and land that was no longer ours. I didn't know you were married." "I am not anymore." The hammer came down harder than necessary. "He died defending land we had already lost. Soldiers said it was trespassing, that we had no right to be on property the government gave away to settlers who had never seen it, who did not know its spirit or its history." Cole's own hammer stilled mid-swing. "You said your daughter died of fever on the reservation." "She did. 2 years after they shot her in the leg while she ran from them." Ayana's face was stone, but something burned behind her eyes. "Istas was 5 years old. She heard the gunshots and ran like any child would. They chased her. For sport, I think. The bullet shattered bone. No doctor would treat an Apache child. The wound festered for months before we were forced onto San Carlos. By then, infection had set so deep into bone that nothing could save her. So yes, fever killed her. But soldiers pulled the trigger 2 years before she stopped breathing." The casual cruelty of it made Cole's stomach turn. He thought about Nathaniel, about random fever and impersonal death. What Ayana described was different, deliberate, done by men who probably went home and kissed their own children and never lost a night's sleep. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She moved to the next post with mechanical precision. "Sorry doesn't rebuild anything. Sorry doesn't bring back the dead or undo the past. Sorry is what people say when they want to feel better about things they cannot change." They finished the corral in silence, heavy with ghosts. When the last rail was secure, Cole stepped back to survey their work. The fence looked better than it had in years, sturdy and intentional, the kind of structure that suggested someone might actually use it again, might actually have plans extending beyond the next day's survival. "I have 3 horses, Cole said, not looking at her. "Been letting them run wild because I couldn't be bothered to pen them properly. If you're going to be here a few more days, we might as well bring them in. Make sure they're sound." Ayana wiped her hands on her already ruined dress. "I will need to see your tack. Check for rot there, too. You always this relentless about maintenance? You always this resistant to keeping things alive?" She met his eyes, and there was challenge there, but also something else, understanding maybe. Recognition of a fellow survivor who'd forgotten how to do anything but barely survive, who'd mistaken existence for living and called it enough. They walked out to where the horses grazed, maybe a quarter-mile from the ranch house. 3 horses that had once been Cole's pride, now half wild from neglect. 2 mares and a gelding, all showing the effects of years without proper care. The horses saw Cole and shied away, no longer trusting the man who'd abandoned them to fend for themselves. But they saw Ayana and curiosity overcame caution. She approached them, speaking low in Apache, rhythmic and soothing, sounds that transcended language, and spoke directly to something ancient in the animal's hindbrain. She didn't walk straight at them, didn't try to corner or force, just moved in a wide circle, giving them space to choose, and one by one they came to her. The gelding first, brave or stupid. She examined him with hands that knew horses intimately, checking hooves and teeth and glands with practiced efficiency. "This one has thrush," she announced, her fingers gentle on the infected hoof. "Needs treatment. And this mare—" She moved to the bay, running experienced hands over the animal's belly. "She is pregnant, maybe 3 months. She will foal in winter." Cole stared. "Pregnant? You did not notice?" There was no judgment in the question, just genuine curiosity about how someone could be so disconnected from their own animals. I haven't paid attention in. He trailed off, not wanting to admit how long he'd stopped caring about anything beyond his own slow dissolution. Ayana's look said she knew anyway. She will need shelter when the time comes. Grain, attention. Complications can kill both mother and foal if no one is watching. The unspoken question hung between them. Would he care? Would he let another thing die through neglect? Or had something changed in the past day and a half? Cole didn't have an answer, so he just nodded and helped her lead all three horses back to the newly repaired corral. Ayana handled them with such natural ease that it made his own clumsy efforts look amateurish. Apache horse culture was legendary for a reason. Back at the ranch, she treated the gelding's thrush with herbs from her medicine bag, mixing yarrow powder with something else into a paste that she worked carefully into the affected hoof. Where did you learn horse medicine? From my grandmother. She was what you would call a horse whisperer, though we had no such term. She said horses and Apaches understand each other because we are both stubborn and both survivors. Both refuse to be broken, even when the world insists we should be. Cole watched her gentle hands healing his neglected animal and felt something crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. He'd spent 6 years hearing stories about savage Apaches who raided and killed. But watching her tend his horse with such care, listening to her talk about her grandmother with quiet love, he realized he'd been lied to. Or maybe he'd been lying to himself, accepting convenient narratives that justified the unjustifiable. Apaches weren't monsters. They were people. People who'd been systematically destroyed by men who looked like him, who prayed to the same God he'd once believed in, who called it civilization and progress and manifest destiny while committing horrors that would haunt history. The realization sat heavy and uncomfortable, forcing him to confront prejudices he hadn't even known he carried. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of fire. Elijah was inside, already asleep despite the early hour, exhausted from a day spent exploring the ranch under Ayana's watchful eye. Do you ever regret it? Cole asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Coming here instead of finding somewhere with more people, more life? Ayana was working leather in her lap, hands busy with the constant need to create, to make useful things from raw materials. She considered the question seriously before answering. I had more people once, had a whole community, a whole tribe, a whole way of life. It did not save anyone, did not stop the soldiers or the starvation or the displacement. She tied off a braid, started another. This place has one person who sees me as I am. Not as a problem to solve or a symbol to worship or a thing to manage. That is more than I thought I would ever have again. Cole felt something in his chest release. Tension he'd been carrying since the moment he opened his door to find her standing there. I see you, he said quietly. See how hard you work, how you fixed everything I let break, how you're trying to build a future in a place I turned into a tomb. We are building it, Ayana corrected gently. You are the one who chose to let me stay, who worked beside me even when your body protested, who trusted me enough to show vulnerability. That takes more courage than isolation ever did. They sat together as darkness fell, watching stars emerge in a sky so vast and clear, it seemed to go on forever. The land stretched out before them, full of work yet to be done and seasons yet to come. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, tomorrow felt like a promise instead of a threat. The morning of the fourth day broke with dust on the horizon. Cole saw it while checking the well, his gut immediately recognizing the pattern. Riders, multiple, moving fast. Ayana! His voice carried the sharp edge of warning honed in 100 cavalry skirmishes. She was out of the cabin in seconds, knife in hand, though he hadn't seen where she'd been carrying it. Elijah appeared behind her, small and silent, already learning to move like a shadow. They watched together as the column resolved into clarity. 10 cavalry soldiers in Union blue pushing hard. They were chasing something, and whatever it was had them riding their horses into the ground. Cole's hand moved to his peacemaker, old instincts taking over. He counted them automatically, assessed their weapons, calculated fields of fire, and covered the way he'd done at Shiloh and Antietam and a dozen other places where mathematics meant the difference between living and dying. The column split. Most continued east, but 3 broke off toward the ranch. Cole's jaw tightened. This was no social call. The sergeant who dismounted was young, maybe 30, with hard eyes that had seen too much frontier violence too soon. He had the look of a true believer, the dangerous kind who thought he was doing God's work. "Afternoon, sir. Sergeant Wade Cassidy, 3rd Cavalry out of Fort Grant." His eyes immediately found Ayanna, cataloging her Apache features with the quick assessment of a man trained to see threats everywhere. "We're pursuing a group of renegade Apaches who escaped from San Carlos last month. You seen any suspicious activity?" Cole's mind raced, years of military experience telling him how to play this, how to give answers that satisfied without revealing. He glanced at Ayanna, who stood very still, very straight, face carefully blank, but fear burning underneath like banked coals. "This your woman?" Cassidy's tone made it clear what he thought about white men who took Apache wives. Cole made a choice that would change everything. The lie came smooth and practiced, delivered with the confidence of a man who'd bluffed his way through too many poker games to count. "My wife, Ayanna Brennan. We're married legal. Got the certificate inside if you need to see it." He let steel enter his voice, the officer's tone that expected to be obeyed. "She's been here with me for 2 months. As for suspicious activity, haven't seen a soul except Thomas Carver 3 weeks back, and he's about as dangerous as a church mouse." Cassidy's eyes narrowed, clearly not satisfied but equally clearly on uncertain ground. "She got papers proving she's allowed off the reservation?" "She doesn't need papers." Cole's voice was steady, authoritative. "She's married to a white citizen. That makes her status legal under territorial law. Unless you're questioning the validity of Christian marriage now, Sergeant?" It was a bluff, and both men knew it. But Cassidy also knew he was on shaky legal ground, that harassing a white landowner's wife without cause could bring trouble he didn't need. "What about the Apaches we're chasing? You see anything or not?" Over the sergeant's shoulder, Cole saw movement in the brush near the creek. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, Apache, trying to stay hidden, wounded from the blood darkening the shoulder of a torn shirt. One of the band they were hunting, probably. Left behind when the adults ran. If the soldiers found the child, they'd kill him, or drag him back to San Carlos, which might be a slower death. Cole looked at Ayanna. She'd seen the child too. Her face was still stone, but her eyes screamed a silent plea. "Please, don't let them find him." The choice crystallized with terrible clarity. Cole could report the child, prove his loyalty, get the soldiers away faster. The safe choice, the smart choice, or he could do the right thing. "Haven't seen anyone," Cole said, meeting Cassidy's eyes without flinching. "But I'll keep watch. You want me to send a word if I do?" Cassidy studied him for a long moment, clearly suspicious, but lacking evidence for anything more. "You seem pretty protective of your Apache wife, mister. Hope you know what you're doing. They're not like us. Can't be trusted. Can't be civilized. Best you remember that before you get a knife in the back one night." Cole felt anger spike hot and unexpected. "They?" His voice dropped to something dangerous, something that made Cassidy's hand drift toward his sidearm. "She's my wife. She's got a name. And she's worth 10 of most white men I've known, including some I served with and most I didn't." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Cassidy mounted up, his face flushed with anger he couldn't quite act on. "We'll be patrolling this area. Anything happens, you're accountable, both of you." They rode off in a cloud of dust and implied threats, and Cole waited until they were completely out of sight before moving. Ayanna was already running toward the creek, and he followed, his old body protesting the sudden sprint, but obeying anyway. The child was huddled in the brush, terrified, speaking rapid Apache as Ayanna dropped to her knees beside him. She responded in the same language, soothing, checking the bullet wound in his shoulder with practiced hands. "Not deep," she said in English for Cole's benefit. "Missed bone, but needs cleaning, or infection will kill him as surely as soldiers." "Bring him inside," Cole said. She looked at him, shocked. "If they come back, then we say he's your nephew. Visiting, legal." Cole met her eyes. "I'm not turning a wounded child over to men who'll kill him." Something in Ayanna's face cracked, just slightly. The first real emotion he'd seen from her that wasn't carefully controlled. carefully rationed. Something that looked almost like hope. They carried the boy inside. Ayana worked with her medicines, cleaning the wound with something that smelled astringent and burning, packing it with herbs, binding it with clean cloth torn from one of Cole's old shirts. The boy, whose name was Karuk, according to Ayana, whimpered but didn't cry. Apache children were taught strength young, taught that survival depended on silence. Cole kept watch at the window, his heart hammering. He'd just lied to federal soldiers, harbored a fugitive. If they came back, if they searched, if they found Karuk hiding in his cabin, he'd hang for it. Or more likely just get shot trying to resist. He didn't care. Looking at Ayana bent over this child, murmuring comfort in Apache, her hands gentle and sure despite everything she'd lost, he realized something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't the enemy. She'd never been the enemy. The enemy was the system that made children into fugitives, that turned survival into a crime, that destroyed entire peoples and called it progress. "What's his name?" Cole asked. Ayana looked up, and in her eyes he saw gratitude and something deeper, something that might have been the beginning of trust. "Karuk, it means bear. He is Nantan's son, my cousin." "Your cousin is with the group they're hunting?" "Nantan leads his own band, 20 people, mostly women and children. They refuse to go to the reservation. Would rather die free in the mountains than slowly on government land." Her voice was fierce with pride and grief. "They are hunted like animals for wanting to live on land that was theirs for 1,000 years." Cole nodded slowly, understanding more than he wanted to about how history would remember this, about which side he'd chosen and what it meant. "How long will he need to stay?" "Until the wound heals enough for him to travel safely. A week, maybe more. Then he stays." That night, after Kuruk was asleep in the bed that had once belonged to Cole's dead son, after Elijah had curled up beside the wounded boy like a protective sibling, Cole and Ayana sat by the fire. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not turning him in, for lying to protect us." "I didn't do it for thanks." "Then why?" Cole stared into the flames, watching them dance and consume, thinking about all the fires he'd seen in his life, campfires during the war, the fire that warmed his family's cabin before fever took them, the cold hearth of 6 years' isolation. "Because I've spent 6 years letting everything die," he said finally. "The ranch, myself, any sense of right and wrong. Today I chose something different." He looked at her. "I chose life and decency because of you." Ayana's eyes glistened with tears she wouldn't let fall. "In my culture, when someone saves a family member's life, they become family, blood bonded, not by birth but by choice and deed. I'm not asking for, I know, but I am giving it." She reached across the space between them, took his hand in hers. First time they'd touched deliberately, skin on skin, and Cole felt something electric pass between them. "You are no longer alone, Cole Brennan. You have Apache family now, whether you want it or not." Her hand was warm, calloused from work, strong in ways that had nothing to do with muscle. Cole held it like it was something precious and breakable, like hope itself made flesh. "I want it," he whispered. "God help me. I want it." They sat like that, hands clasped, watching the fire while a wounded Apache child slept in a dead white boy's bed, and the world outside hunted for reasons to tear them all apart. And Cole Brennan, 58 years old and half dead from grief, felt something he'd thought lost forever. He felt alive. Samuel watched his grandfather's face transform in the fading light, weathered features softening with memory. The old man's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the glass of water on the table between them. "So you protected them," Samuel said, "even knowing it could cost you everything." "Especially knowing that," Cole replied, "because for the first time in 6 years, I had something worth losing. And that made all the difference." "What happened when Thomas found out? When he saw what his interference had created?" Cole's laugh was dry as desert wind. "Thomas Carver got an education in consequences, and I got one in forgiveness. Both were harder earned than either of us expected." He settled deeper into his chair, eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon. "But before any of that could happen, we had to survive what came next. July 1884, Matthews Ranch. A week passed with Karuk healing under Ayana's care. The boy was resilient in the way Apache children learned to be, and her medicine worked with startling efficiency. Cole watched her tend the wound, singing soft songs in Apache, telling stories of warriors and trickster coyotes that made both boys laugh despite the constant threat hanging over them all. He found himself learning their rhythm. Ayana rose before dawn to pray facing east, offering smoke and words to spirits Cole didn't understand but no longer dismissed. Elijah helped with morning chores, learning English from Cole in exchange for teaching him Apache words that felt strange in his mouth. Karak watched everything with eyes that missed nothing, already planning his return to Nantan's band in the mountains. It felt dangerously close to family, and that terrified Cole more than any cavalry patrol. On the eighth day, Cole saw dust on the northwestern horizon. One rider moving at an easy pace. He recognized the gait of the horse before he could make out the rider. Thomas Carver. "Thomas is coming," Cole said, and the cabin's easy morning rhythm shattered like glass. Ayana's hands stilled on the bread dough she'd been kneading. "The man who forged the papers." "Yeah." Cole's jaw tightened. "Let me handle this." But Ayana was already moving, ushering both boys into the back room, speaking low and urgent in Apache. When she emerged, her face was set like stone, ready for battle. Thomas dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who thought he'd done good work. He was older than Cole, mid-60s and weathered by decades of frontier life, with kind eyes that somehow made his interference worse. Good intentions paving hell's road. "Cole, eh?" He was smiling, damn him. "I can see from here the place looks better. The roof's patched, the corral's fixed. And that must be..." He turned to Ayana, tipping his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "Ma'am, I'm Thomas Carver. I hope the arrangement has been satisfactory." "The arrangement?" Ayana's voice could have frozen whiskey. "You mean the forged document that brought me here under false pretenses? That lied to both of us and put my life and the lives of children in danger?" Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable, his smile fading. "Now, I didn't mean any harm. Cole wasn't going to help himself. Somebody had to do something before he drank himself to death or just gave up entirely. Nobody had to do anything." Cole stepped forward, anger rising like mercury in summer heat. "You forged my signature, Thomas. Sent a woman and a boy into the wilderness based on lies. Took money from people desperate enough to believe your fantasy. Do you understand what you did?" "I understand I saved you." Thomas gestured at the repaired structures, the visible evidence of work and care. "Look at this place. Look at yourself. You're alive again, Cole. Actually living instead of just waiting to die. That wouldn't have happened if I'd left you to rot in your grief." The words stung because they held truth Cole didn't want to acknowledge. He was different. The ranch was better. He could feel himself breathing deeper, standing straighter, caring about tomorrow in ways he hadn't for 6 years. But the method, the violation, the sheer arrogance of assuming he knew what was best for someone else's life. "You didn't save anyone," Ayana cut in before Cole could respond, her voice like a blade through silk. "You traded one person's autonomy for your own sense of righteousness. I came here believing I had a contract, an agreement made in good faith. Instead, I found a man who knew nothing about me, who wanted nothing to do with me, who had every right to send me away to die in country I didn't know." "But he didn't send you away," Thomas protested, confusion replacing confidence. "You're still here, working together. The ranch is functioning again. I can see it worked out, just like I hoped." "Not because of your plan." Cole moved to stand beside Ayana, deliberate unity that made its own statement. "Because we chose it. After your lies almost destroyed any chance we had at making something real. After we had to decide whether to trust each other despite the poisoned foundation you built." Thomas's eyes moved past them, noticing details he'd missed in his initial assessment. "Is that a child I hear in there, 2 children?" Cole's hand moved closer to his gun. "Ayana's nephews. Visiting. None of your concern." "Nephews." Thomas's tone suggested he knew exactly what that meant. What kind of danger Cole had put himself in by harboring Apache children during an active cavalry hunt. "Cole, if you're doing what I think you're doing, if those boys are..." "Careful, Thomas." Cole's voice dropped to something dangerous. the officer's tone that had sent men into battle. "You're about to accuse my wife of harboring fugitives on my property. That's a serious claim to make without evidence." "Your wife?" Thomas blinked. "You two actually got married?" "Not yet," Ayanna said, and Cole felt surprise ripple through him at the certainty in her voice. "But we will. And when we do, it will be our choice, not yours, not anyone's but ours." The we sat between them like a promise neither had known they were making until the words were spoken. Cole looked at Ayanna and saw his own surprise reflected back, mixed with something that might have been hope. Thomas deflated, seeing he'd lost his confrontation before it fully began. But there was something else in his face now, something that looked almost like concern cutting through his wounded pride. "You should know," he said quietly, all bluster gone, "that Jack Morrison has been asking questions in town. About you, Cole. About your claim to this land." Ice water dumped down Cole's spine. "Morrison, what's that snake want with my property? Seems he thinks he's got some old Spanish land grant that overlaps your acreage. Been making noise about complications." Thomas glanced at Ayanna with obvious meaning. "Legal complications, like whether a white man married to an Apache has the same rights as other citizens. Whether that kind of marriage is even legal under territorial law." The threat was clear and immediate. Morrison could use Ayanna's presence, their relationship, as leverage to steal everything Cole had built. And there wasn't a damn thing the law would do to stop him. "Get out, Thomas." Cole's voice was quiet but absolute. "Go home. Don't come back unless we send for you. And don't ever, ever make decisions for another person's life without their consent. No matter how good your intentions. No matter how certain you are that you know better. You understand me?" Thomas nodded slowly, mounting his horse with movements that suddenly looked old and tired. "I'm sorry," he said. "I truly am. I just wanted to help." "Then help by leaving us alone," Ayanna said, not unkindly but with finality that accepted no argument. "What we build here will be ours, or it will be nothing. There is no third option." They watched him ride away, dust settling slowly in the afternoon stillness. When he was gone, truly gone, Ayanna turned to Cole. "He was right about one thing. We are alive again. Because we chose it." Cole looked at the ranch, at the work they had done together, at the evidence of care where neglect had ruled for so long. "Not because someone forced us into it." "So what now?" Ayanna asked, and the question carried weight that had nothing to do with Thomas's visit. "The arrangement he made is fiction. The papers are destroyed. There is no legal tie keeping me here. Nothing but the choice we make every morning when we wake up and decide if this is still where we want to be." Cole felt the full weight of what she was offering. She could leave now. Could walk away from this experiment in shared survival and find something easier. Somewhere without his ghosts and his failing body and the constant threat of men like Morrison turning their lives into leverage for land theft. But when he looked at her, he saw the same fear reflected back, the understanding that they'd both chosen something terrifying, something with no guarantees, something that could destroy them worse than isolation ever had. "Then we keep choosing," Cole said simply, "every day. And if it ever stops being a choice, if it becomes a trap, we're honest about it. We owe each other that much." "Every day," Ayanna agreed. Behind them, inside the cabin, they heard Kuruk laugh at something Elijah had said. The sound of children being children, despite everything. The sound of hope persisting against all odds. "I'll remember," he promised. That night, Kuruk left to return to Nantan's band in the mountains. Cole watched as Ayanna gave the boy careful instructions, speaking in rapid Apache while tracing symbols in the dirt. When she finished, Kuruk nodded solemnly, then disappeared into the darkness with the silence of his people. "What did you tell him?" Cole asked. "To tell Nantan we may need him, that a man threatens our family." Ayanna's face was calm. "Nantan will watch. If Morrison comes with violins, my cousin will know." "How?" "The old ways, smoke signals, the movement of birds, signs white men do not see because they do not know to look." She met his eyes. "Trust me. If we need help, it will come." 2 days later, Morrison arrived. Cole was ready this time. Gun cleaned, loaded, worn openly in a way he hadn't bothered with for years. Ayanna was inside with Elijah, both armed with knives, both understanding that what came next could mean death or worse. Jack Morrison rode up with 5 hired guns, hard men with eyes like winter and morals to match. Morrison himself was a big man, mid-40s, with cold calculation written in every line of his face. He wore expensive clothes that marked him as someone who'd profited handsomely from other people's desperation. Cole recognized the type instantly. Had fought against men like this during the war, men who saw conflict as opportunity, who understood that chaos created vacuum and vacuum created profit for those ruthless enough to seize it. Cole Brennan. Morrison didn't dismount. Power play obvious and deliberate. Heard you've taken yourself an Apache squaw. Congratulations on lowering yourself to their level. Cole's hand didn't move toward his gun. Didn't need to. The threat was in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders, in the absolute stillness of a man who'd killed before and would do it again if pressed. That word doesn't get used on my land, he said quietly. And she's my wife, soon to be legal if she'll have me. You got business here, Morrison stated, and move on. Ooh. Morrison's smile never reached his eyes. Business, yes. See, I've got a claim to this land. Old Spanish grant, all legal and proper. Filed it with the territorial office last week. Normally, I'd just proceed with eviction once the paperwork clears. But seeing as we both served, you for the Union and me for the glorious Confederacy that should have won, he let that hang, old hatred simmering under thin pretense of civility. I'm willing to make you an offer, $500, cash money, and I'll forget about my claim. You can stay on as a tenant if you like, work the land for shares. Or you can take the money and start over somewhere else. Somewhere your taste for Apache flesh won't be quite so noticed. $500. Cole didn't have 50, and Morrison knew it, the calculation clear in his predator's smile. And if I don't sell? Then I file for immediate possession, and I mention to the territorial marshal that you're harboring fugitive Apaches, reservation jumpers, maybe even some of Geronimo's band, who knows? Morrison's eyes slid toward the cabin where Ayanna stood in the doorway. Cavalry takes your woman back to San Carlos. Those Apache brats get shot trying to escape, like they do. You lose the land anyway, but with federal charges attached. Prison time, maybe. Or a hanging if the judge is in a particularly patriotic mood. Cole felt the trap closing with mechanical precision. Everything he'd built with Ayanna, the fragile trust and partnership and the first stirrings of something deeper, Morrison could destroy with a single letter to the authorities. And he'd do it smiling, righteous in the certainty that he was civilizing the frontier one stolen ranch at a time. 1 week, Morrison said, gathering his reins. You've got 1 week to come up with the money or accept my generous offer. After that, things get ugly. And Brennan, I'd advise keeping that Apache wife of yours inside and out of sight. White men around here don't take kindly to race mixing. Accidents happen. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Then Morrison and his hired guns rode off, laughing among themselves about something Cole couldn't hear and probably didn't want to. Inside, Ayanna's face was stone, but Cole saw her hands shake before she controlled them. Elijah pressed against her side, the boy understanding that death had just ridden past, wearing expensive clothes and carrying legal papers. We fight, Ayanna said simply. Against 6 guns? Cole shook his head. They'll kill us all. Then we run, take the boys, go to the mountains, find Nantan. No. Cole grabbed her shoulders, made her look at him. You're not running anymore. Not from Morrison, not from anyone. We make this legal. We get married, actual married, in town with papers. That changes your status, makes you harder to deport. Gives us legal standing to fight his claim. Marriage does not stop men like Morrison. No, but it's a start. Cole's mind was racing, pulling up everything he'd learned about law and land claims during his years in Arizona. And then we get help. From who? Thomas betrayed us. The cavalry hunts us. Who? Your cousin, Nantan. Ayanna stared. You want to ask Apache warriors for help? You, a white man, a former Union soldier? I'm asking family for help. Cole met her eyes. You said I was blood bonded when I saved Karuk. Does that mean something, or was it just words? Her face softened. It means everything. Then send word. Tell Nantan we need allies, and in the meantime, Cole moved to the drawer where Abigail's photograph lived. He pulled it out, looked at it for the first time in months, his wife smiling, his son in her arms. Both gone, both loved. Both, he hoped, at peace with what he was about to do. "I'm sorry," he whispered to them, "but I'm choosing to live again. And I hope wherever you are, you understand." He closed the drawer gently with reverence, but also with finality. Then he turned to Ayana, who was watching with tears tracking silently down her face. The first time he'd seen her cry. "Ayana." He took her hands, rough and scarred and beautiful in their strength. "I'm asking you to marry me. Not for convenience, not just for legal protection. I'm asking because somewhere between the roof repair and the horses and watching you heal those boys, I fell in love with you. And I want to fight for a future together, whatever that looks like. If you'll have me." The silence stretched so long his heart forgot how to beat. Then she reached up, cupped his weathered face in her calloused hands. "I am terrified," she admitted, voice breaking. "Everyone I have loved has died. My parents, my husband, my daughter. What if I bring death to you too? What if loving me is a curse?" "Then we die fighting side by side instead of alone in the dark," Cole said. "And that's better than 6 more years of what I had before you arrived." Ayana kissed him. First real kiss. Not a peck, but a claim, desperate and tender and full of all the things neither had words for. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, both trembling with the magnitude of the choice they were making. "Yes," she said. "I choose you. I choose us. Every day, no matter what comes." Kuruk, watching from the corner, said something in Apache that made Elijah burst out laughing. Ayana smiled through her tears. "He says it is about time, that we have been making eyes at each other like lovesick teenagers for days, and it was becoming embarrassing to watch." "Smart kid," Cole said, and felt something he'd thought dead forever stirring in his chest. Joy. They rode for town the next morning, all 4 of them, because leaving the boys alone was too dangerous and splitting up was worse. 3 days hard riding with constant vigilance for cavalry patrols, for Morrison's men, for bounty hunters who'd recognize Apache children and see dollar signs. But they made it. The town was small and dusty, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business and strangers were marked immediately. The stares started the moment they rode in. A white man and an Apache woman, 2 Apache boys. The whispers followed like flies. One man spat at Ayana's feet as they passed. Cole's hand moved to his gun. Ayana touched his arm, stopped him. "Not worth it," she said quietly. "I have endured worse." But Cole saw the way she held her head higher, spine straight and proud, refusing to show these people anything that looked like shame or fear. And he loved her more for it. The justice of the peace was an old man named Hoskins, weathered and practical, who'd seen enough of life to know that judgment was God's job, not his. "You sure about this, son?" He eyed Ayana with something that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't acceptance either. "Marrying an Apache, you know the talk it'll bring. Make your life harder than it needs to be." "I'm sure," Cole's voice was iron. "You going to marry us, or do we ride to the next town?" Hoskins sighed. "Need a witness." A voice from the door made them all turn. "I'll stand witness." Thomas Carver stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking older and more uncertain than Cole had ever seen him. "What are you doing here?" Cole demanded. "Heard you were coming to town. Figured you might need someone, and—" Thomas looked at Ayana. "I was wrong about how I did things. Maybe not wrong that you two belong together, but wrong about everything else. Let me do this one thing right." Ayana studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You may stand witness." The ceremony was brief and practical, no romance in the words, just legal binding, spoken and recorded. But when Hoskins said, "Do you take this woman?" Cole said, "I do," like an oath, like a vow he'd die keeping. And when Ayana said, "I do," her voice was steady and sure, no hesitation despite everything she was risking. The kiss was longer this time, more certain. When they broke apart, Elijah was grinning, and even Kuruk looked pleased. "Mrs. Cole Brennan," Hoskins wrote on the certificate. Ayana stared at the name, and Cole saw loss in her eyes. She was trading part of her identity for safety, becoming legally white in the eyes of the law, erasing centuries of Apache heritage with a stroke of a pen. "You are still Ayana," he said firmly. Still Apache. This paper doesn't change who you are. Just makes it harder for bastards like Morrison to destroy what we're building. She touched the certificate like it might burn her. I know, but it feels like dying a little, becoming someone else to survive. Then we make sure it's worth it, Cole said. We make sure what we build honors everything you're sacrificing. They bought a simple silver band with the last of Cole's money and he slid it onto her finger. It wasn't much, scratched and plain, bought from a traveling tinker's cart, but Ayana looked at it like it was the most precious thing in the world. It is everything, she whispered. They returned to find Morrison waiting. But this time he'd brought 8 men, and they weren't just hired guns. They were the kind of men who enjoyed violence, who saw it as entertainment rather than necessity. And Morrison himself wore a smile that promised pain. "Week's not up yet, Brennan," he called out as they approached. But I got impatient, figured I'd simplify things. He saw Ayana by him, saw the wedding band on her finger, and his smile widened. "Heard you went and married her legal. That's touching. Real romantic. But it doesn't change the land claim. And it doesn't change what happens when I file a report about those Apache boys you're hiding." Cole's hand moved to his Winchester, but 8 guns were already trained on them. Suicide to draw. Then a sound cut through the tension, a war cry in Apache, high and ululating, the sound that had terrified settlers for generations. From the ridge behind the ranch, riders appeared. Apache warriors, maybe 12 of them, painted and armed, looking like everything Morrison had ever feared about the frontier. Leading them was a man who could only be Nantan, tall and fierce. With Ayana's eyes and a harder face, Morrison's men turned, suddenly surrounded, suddenly outnumbered. The certainty drained from Morrison's face, replaced by something much more satisfying. Fear. Ayana called out in Apache, rapid and urgent. Nantan responded, then looked at Cole with an assessment that felt like standing before a firing squad. Cole met his gaze without flinching, understanding this was a test he couldn't afford to fail. Nantan spoke in accented English. "This man threatens my cousin, my blood. In Apache law, that means death. You can't—" Morrison's voice cracked. "This is American territory. You're all fugitives. I'll have the cavalry." "This is Apache land," Nantan said quietly. "Always was. You just occupy it temporarily. We lived here 1,000 years before your people came. We'll be here 1,000 years after you leave." He drew his bow, arrow notched. "Leave now, do not return, or we make it official war. You want that? Want to explain to your government why you started another Apache uprising over one ranch?" Morrison looked at his men, saw no support there. They were hired guns, not martyrs. They understood survival math better than ideology. "This isn't over," Morrison snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "Yes, it is." Cole's voice was quiet but carried absolute conviction. "You come back here, you deal with both white law and Apache justice. That's a war on 2 fronts you can't win. So right away, Morrison, tell everyone the land's claimed and protected, and pray I never see your face again." They went, scrambling onto horses, riding hard like devils were chasing them. Maybe they were. When the dust settled, Nantan dismounted slowly, approached Cole with caution, appropriate to men meeting as equals rather than enemies. Up close, Cole could see the scars, the hard-won wisdom in eyes too young to be so old, the weight of responsibility for 20 lives living free against impossible odds. Nantan clasped Cole's forearm in the warrior's greeting, said something in Apache that made Ayana's breath catch. "He says you have earned Apache respect," she translated, voice thick with emotion. "That you fought to protect family. That makes you brother, not by blood but by choice. The strongest bond there is." Cole's throat tightened. "Tell him thank you for coming, for trusting me enough to answer the call." Nantan smiled, and it transformed his face into something younger, more hopeful. He spoke again, longer this time. "He says the mountains are open to you always," Ayana translated. "That if you ever need sanctuary, if the white man's law becomes too much to bear, there is a place for you among his people. For both of us, for the boys, for any children who come after." After the warriors left with promises to watch the territory and send warning of any threats, After Karuk went with them back to his father because the wound had healed and the mountains called, after they'd stood watching until the riders disappeared into the high country, Cole and Ayana finally turned to face what they'd built together. The ranch looked different in the evening light. Not perfect, still carrying scars of neglect, but alive again. The repaired roof held strong. The corral fence stood straight. The horses grazed peacefully, the pregnant mare growing round with new life. "We did it," Ayana said quietly. "We built something that isn't broken." "We're still broken," Cole corrected gently. "But we built something anyway. And maybe that's better. Not pretending to be whole, just choosing to build despite the cracks." Ayana's smile was small and precious, earned through loss and maintained through hope. "That is much better." They stood on the porch as full darkness fell, watching stars emerge in impossible numbers. Elijah was inside, already asleep, exhausted by days of tension, finally released. Tomorrow he'd help with chores and learn more English and be the child he deserved to be, instead of the survivor circumstances had forced him to become. "What should we name the foal?" Ayana asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "When the mare gives birth this winter." Cole thought about it, about legacy and memory, about how the dead deserved honor, but the living deserve futures. "Nathaniel, he said, after my son, if that's acceptable." "And if we—" Ayana's hand moved to her stomach, protective gesture she probably didn't realize she was making. "If children come for us, what then?" Cole's heart stopped. "Are you saying—" "I am saying it is possible, that we should think about it, about names and futures and all the things I stopped letting myself imagine." She looked at him. "If a daughter comes, I want to name her Istis, after mine. So both our lost children are remembered in the new life we create." Cole couldn't speak past the emotion choking his throat, could only pull her close and hold her, while overhead the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and the land breathed around them, and the future opened up like a flower in spring. Present day, 1920. The old man fell silent, lost in memory, so vivid his grandson could almost see it reflected in those gray-blue depths that had witnessed so much history. "So you rebuilt everything," Samuel said softly. "The ranch, your life, your capacity to love." "We rebuilt together," Cole corrected. "And it wasn't easy, wasn't clean or simple, or any of the things stories make it out to be. We fought sometimes, had hard days when the grief came back so strong it felt like drowning. But we had more good days than bad, and every morning we chose each other again." "What happened to Morrison?" "Left Arizona entirely after word spread he'd tried to steal a veteran's land and got run off by Apaches. Died broke in Texas 5 years later. Thomas came around eventually, became a real friend instead of an interfering neighbor. Helped raise Elijah like the uncle he should have been from the start." "And Ayana?" Cole's face transformed, love shining through despite 36 years of marriage and all the ways time changes people. "She's inside right now making dinner. 67 years old and still more stubborn than a mule, still more capable than any two people combined. We raised Elijah as our own son. He's a school teacher now in Tucson, teaching Apache and English to children of both peoples. Married a good woman, gave us 2 grandchildren. And Ayana and I had 3 children of our blood. Lost one to fever in her first year, but raised the other 2 strong. Between Elijah's family and ours, this house has been filled with the noise and life of 5 generations now." He stood slowly, joints protesting, and walked to the porch railing. "That's why I wanted you to hear this story, Samuel. Because you're heading off to university next month, going to become a lawyer, going to fight for justice in a world that desperately needs it. And I want you to remember that the most important battles aren't always the ones fought with guns or laws or grand gestures. What are they fought with? Choice," Cole said simply. "The choice to open a door instead of closing it. The choice to see people as human instead of other. The choice to build instead of destroy, to hope instead of despair, to love instead of hate. Those choices made every single day, that's what changes the world." Samuel stood beside his grandfather, looking out at land that had been desert and neglect and was now green and productive and alive with possibility. "I'll remember," he promised. Behind them, the screen door opened and Ayana emerged, silver threading through her black hair, but eyes still sharp as a hawk's, still carrying herself with the proud bearing of her people. Dinner is ready, she said in English that had long since lost its hesitant edges. And stop filling the boy's head with stories that make you sound heroic. You were a stubborn old fool who got lucky I was desperate enough to stay. Cole laughed, the sound rich and full and completely alive. That's absolutely true, but you stayed anyway. I stayed because you made it worth staying, Ayana said, coming to stand on his other side, fitting into the space beside him like she'd been made for it. Because you chose to see me instead of my people's reputation. Because you chose to build something worth protecting. Samuel watched them together, these two people who'd found each other across impossible odds, who'd built a life from loss and love from grief, who'd chosen each other every day for 36 years and counting. And he understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him, that the best arrivals are the unexpected ones. The best choices are the terrifying ones. And the best love is the kind you choose every single day, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when the world says it's wrong, especially then, because that's when it matters most. Inside, dinner waited. Outside, the ranch that had been a tomb was now a home. And overhead, the Arizona stars shone down on a family built not by blood alone, but by choice and courage, and the simple revolutionary act of refusing to let hate have the final word. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to build or destroy, to hope or despair, to love or hate. But tonight, 3 generations stood together under those stars, connected by stories and blood, and the understanding that every ending is really a beginning if you're brave enough to see it that way. And that sometimes the knock on the door you never asked for brings exactly what you needed most, even if you were too broken to know you needed it at all.